want to shout out about. You'll go last, which means that you'll have time to think about something while Chuck and I give ours.
Cool. We appear to be live.
Yeah, I clicked the button.
So let me now retweet it. The account is JS Jabber on X.
Yeah. Did you
Okay.
find it, or do you need the link?
Nah, it's cool. I'll find it. Got it. And
Alright.
it's reposted. So off we go.
Yeah, we've got 8 people, 9. So I'll go ahead and get us started. 10. Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Dan Shapir.
Hello from Israel.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and we have a special guest this week, and that is Tomer Gabel. I am sorry, I don't do the Hebrew pronunciation, so
That was actually fairly accurate.
awesome. Now you and Dan are friends. You do JavaScript, mostly not on the front end, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, do you want to kind of give us a little bit more of your background?
Sure.
Who you are, where you're coming from with this stuff?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Dan and I have been friends for a while. We used to work together at Wix for a few years, and then we kind of split ways professionally, but remain friends. As you might have mentioned, I am not very heavily into front-end development. I will reiterate the usual disclosure, which is I have nothing against it. I'm just not very good at it, and therefore leave it to people who are good at it and are passionate about it. On the other hand, I do see myself as kind of a general purpose engineer, so I don't really see the distinction between front-end, back-end, in the general sense. Engineering is engineering is engineering. Some of these disciplines require skill sets that slightly differ. Mine doesn't lead towards users really and people. So that's why I'm in backend. You might say I'm a backend engineer, system architect, DevOps guy, whatever is needed at the time. I've been in the industry for over 20 years now, and for the last 3 and change have been independent, so consulting companies on basically everything they need, everything except front end. Yeah, and I kind of see myself as an engineer that solves problems, whether they be educational, functional, performance, or anything else really, or organizational at times.
I'll just add to that that Tomer and I we meet, we hang out when we can, and when we do, we almost inevitably also get into technical debates. Like, we both hold strong opinions, and interestingly enough, they sometimes conflict. And
That's the
and
best.
and that's the best. I'm usually pretty stubborn and I hope also convincing, but Tomer is somehow very often able to kind of force my hand to kind of change my opinions on stuff. So I really am looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, those kinds of debates, in my opinion, are important because, yeah, they force you to really solidify where you're at or change your mind.
Or just learn to express your opinions better.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, so we're in the middle of the political season here in the United States. I'm fairly involved in one of the major political parties. I'm the vice chair of the county party. And right, so we have discussions, and often we have discussions with people that don't agree with us, both within the party and outside the party. And yeah, it's terrific because you get to have the back and forth. And yeah, sometimes it's, you make a really good argument and I have to go think about that. And sometimes it's, you've made excellent arguments and you've convinced me. And sometimes it's, we agree, but some of the nuance kind of gets threaded out during the conversation. So I love it. I love it.
As long as it's done in good faith.
Yes.
That's really what I care about. And of course, when it's tech, it should be based on actual, information or data as
Hmm.
much as possible, rather than just, this is my opinion and I'll die on this hill because it is.
Yep. Yep. Cool.
May
So,
I may challenge that a little bit. That can be one of the topics for discussion if you want. But I think honestly, I think it's not so much that data is overrated because it's not. It's that many fewer discussions, especially around issues of how to engineer, what good engineering is. A lot of these discussions are qualitative almost by definition, and trying to inject data into those arguments tends to, like at this point, I view it as in many cases more of a logical fallacy than an actual argument.
mhm.
But we can circle back to that if you
It's
want.
like lies, damn lies, and statistics.
It's more like if you're measuring what's easy because that's all you can measure, then don't expect me to take it very seriously.
Yeah,
Fair.
that is fair.
So, I got this list of things that are, I guess, ideas. You guys said slaughtering sacred cows, and mentioned that this is a Hebrew term, but it's a term that's used in English in America too. So I'm just gonna hang with it here. But yeah, so what sacred cows are we slaughtering? Where are we going with this?
By
Where are
the
we
way, if we just before we start, if you've got, some listeners, and they have ideas for additional, sacred cows they might like us to roast, to discuss or roast or eat or whatever, then they should know they can feel free to just post them in the very relevant chats.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the more the better. There's always something to argue about. I'm sorry, debate in good faith about.
Don't do that when I'm drinking.
Of course, the fun in not doing that when you're drinking.
Yeah. So
All right.
so where do you guys want to start?
With the first one, I guess.
All right.
All right, so we kind of put together a list and sort of prioritized it by nothing so well defined as our hunch at what would be engaging for the audience, which is to say that if the audience actually wants to participate and indicate to us whether we're on the right track or they have some other ideas for what to talk about, then that would be terrific. But Don, you want to introduce the first hypothetical item on the agenda?
Yeah. So uh, everybody, we all of us here are programmers, and probably the number one tool for programming is the programming language, because at the end of the day, that's how you convey your
Mhm.
intentions to the computer that actually hopefully executes something similar to what you wanted it to do. And consequently, people or developers are really hung up on their choice of a programming language, to the extent that I still remember when I interviewed somebody for a position way back in the 90s, I think. They told me, if you're not working in Java, I'm not interested in working here. And so it seems that the choice of programming language should be like the number one priority. It's like the number one most important tool in your toolbox. So it's the number one priority of making the right choice. And yet, it seems that Tomer doesn't think that that's the case. So, Tomer, take it away.
Well, I want to
So,
pile on here because
yeah.
it goes the other way too, right? It's not just programmers saying, I want to work in .NET or Java or Ruby or JavaScript or whatever node. But the employers list the jobs that way, right? This is a React job. This is a PHP job. This right, and so it kind of cuts both ways. Anyway, go ahead, Tomer.
So there's a few angles with which we could sort of tackle this, but I'll start by saying this. I don't actually think there's any argument to be made about companies listing those requirements, because functionally speaking, when you hire an engineer, you may or may not need someone with
Right.
immediately applicable experience, or you might not be able to afford a long onboarding or whatever it is. So it's a much more kind of tactical decision, I think. There's nothing. I've yet to encounter a company that espouses, we only hire for these languages because we think everyone else is garbage, right? Or whatever way you want to put it. So it's a much more functional decision. On the other hand, I would say that to Dunn's earlier point, which is, it should be priority one of the decisions you make. Presumably, in this context, it's on a new project or a new company, a new organization, whatever it is. I would agree with you. It is the first priority, but I would disagree on why that is. I don't think it's because the choice matters as much as people think. I think it's because it is the first choice you have to make before you actually start doing anything beyond brainstorming on what it is you're building. Right? The first line of code you write has to be in some language, which means making that decision, and that is a very strategic, far-reaching decision. It applies to everything else you do moving forward from that point. But oftentimes the way you make that decision is not a didactic thought process. You don't go, which is the language that best suits my domain? 99% of the time, and of course there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, what you do is you look at the people you have, you look at the ecosystem chunks that you know best that match the domain you're working in, and then you just reach for the language that most of them know best, or at least most of them are most eager to learn, because that is how you get them productive as soon as humanly possible. And them might just be you, right? If you're on a
Mhm.
startup, you're going to reach out to the language you're most comfortable in. So it is the priority one decision because it is the most urgent decision, or one of the most urgent decisions you need to make. It is not the first priority because it's so important. As for why I think it doesn't matter as much as people think, there's two ways to make that argument. One is the sort of highfalutin philosophical allegory, which is to say, a language is a communication mechanism. Programming languages are unusual in that they provide a medium for communication both between humans and between humans and machines. In that respect, they look different and act different than the languages we speak in. But fundamentally speaking, you can get anything done in any language as a human being, irrespective of computers, right? You want to build an airplane, turns out you can engineer an airplane in French, or in German or in English. And I'm not going to extend that joke in the obvious direction. But more importantly, though, the point I'm making here is you can end up with a functional system in 90% of the domains. There are always exceptions to this. There are always domains where one language would have a clear benefit over another. But for the vast majority of sort of general purpose business software, whether web or not, that everyone writes, you can start off, I'll use the example of a backend because that just happens to be what I know best. You have massive, massive functional systems built in Java, in Python, in OCaml, in PHP, in variants of PHP, because you have, Wikipedia on the one hand and you have Facebook on the other, in Ruby, in virtually anything you'd care to mention. And I'm not even going in the direction of the obvious, people are still writing in COBOL. I'm talking about mainstream purpose-built, relevant software that's been developed in the last 20 years, not in the last, 60. So we're talking internet-facing software. What I feel matters when you're not in a domain which lends itself really, really well to the advantages or disadvantages of any particular language, it ends up being mostly an aesthetic choice, right? Which language do I personally love better? Because if I can, and over a long enough stretch of time, all systems can. If I can build my system in, PHP or JavaScript or TypeScript or Java or Kotlin or Scala or any of those languages, or Python if you must, um, then which one I choose becomes either a functional decision, which is usually the case. It's just the one I happen to know best when I started on this system. And for the vast majorities of businesses, this will end up being the stack for the life cycle of the company. Barring a fundamental rewrite or and the kind of growth that could not have happened 20 years ago, where you go multilingual if you have a lot of services in your company or whatever it is. If you remain a domain specific business for any length of time, you're very likely to be not only on the same stack you started off with as a matter of convenience, but also potentially running code you wrote when you started with that stack as a matter of convenience. And yet you can find working production systems in any of these languages, which to me says it is a matter of aesthetics more than anything else. Some people
So
coming, yeah, sorry, go for it.
So I get what you're saying, and it's obviously true. Like I remember talking with various companies. There was this period of time where I was kind of interested what people were using in the industry. So when you asked about the front end of, and I was asking programming languages, not frameworks. Everybody was obviously JavaScript or TypeScript. But on the back end, there was like this huge variety of things. It might be Java, like you said, it might be
Hmm.
Java, it might be Go, it might be .NET, it might be PHP, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, all these languages are Turing complete, and if they've got the appropriate libraries that you happen to need, then you can definitely go for it. And if you're doing web development, then mostly what you need is like basically HTTP support and to be able to connect to a database, and everybody's got that. But where I'm kind of pushing back, it's about the fact that like you're kind of looking at them as they're kind of all equal, when different programming languages kind of represent, at least in some cases, different philosophies or different approaches to programming. Like, for example, Go, you might say the philosophy is, there should be only one way to do something, and that way should be obvious. If it's maybe if it's Rust, then it's a system language that prioritizes resource lifetime over everything else. Resource ownership, I guess,
I
would
would
be a
say
better
it's
term.
safety over everything else.
Resource safety over everything else. um and obviously, if you're looking at and like, I don't know, another example might be uh, like like C++ might be everything but the kitchen sink type of a philosophy. And JavaScript, well, was designed in 10 days. um, and so they do all represent different approaches. It's like, poetry sounds different when you say it in French or in German or in Japanese or in Russian,
True.
even though all of them have poetry. So,
True.
so the question is, don't these aesthetical or philosophical consideration make a significant difference in your opinion?
No, they don't, because the reality of it is, if you look at every modern programming language ecosystem that's in the mainstream, the sort you would use as a general purpose language on the one hand, which admittedly is getting less and less kind of prevalent in the industry, or as, shall we say, a language that's appropriate for whatever the type of web servers that we all build, or the type of front end applications that your listeners probably tend to build, or at least more so than I do. Um, you look at all these ecosystems, and what they have is in common is While they all have different nuances, and a lot of these nuances are definitely the result of this sort of stark philosophical difference in how they started off, they all end up converging on the same set of tools, or at least tools that look very, very similar. So I think at this point it would be fair to say that as an industry, we've learned that statically known types are useful for code organization and for code reuse. It is debatable whether when you build a system, it's better or not to use it. I have my own opinions. As I say, it's an aesthetic choice because you turns out you can build systems in all of these. But with JavaScript, with Python, with PHP, I'm less familiar with the Ruby angle of things, admittedly. Certainly with Java and that whole ecosystem, which started off as statically typed, you see in the mainstream, which was not the case 20 years ago, all of these ecosystems have first class typing, whether gradual or optional typing kind of shoehorned onto the ecosystem, is the case with Python, or sort of building an ecosystem on top of one, as is the case with TypeScript, um, or built into the mix, as with Java. But all of them have this because we as an industry learned that this is a very beneficial tool for code reuse. When you have libraries and those libraries expose static types and those types are known in advance, it makes code reuse a lot easier because you don't have to reach into the code to figure out how it's going to behave, in an error condition, right? So that's just one example, and debatably, that's just one reason why
So,
static
talking
type.
about that particular reason, and Chuck, you know him better than I do or we do. DHH has a very contrarian opinion here. Like,
Hmm.
you know,
He does.
everybody, it's like from my perspective, looking at the JavaScript ecosystem, you can say that TypeScript has won. I mean, it's possible that there are, looking at the market as a whole, maybe still more
Hmm.
JavaScript is being written than TypeScript. But when I look at enterprise companies, the type of companies, the type of large scale projects that I tend to work on, you know, it's JavaScript only if it's legacy. Everything new is being written in TypeScript. Would you agree? But that's totally the contrary to DHH's opinion of how we should be developing software.
Well, so there are a couple of things here. One is, just coming at it, Tomer mentioned that he's not as familiar with the Ruby ecosystem. The typing is, it's not even hotly debated anymore. There are type systems that you can plug in to get type annotations on your Ruby. The vast majority of the community doesn't use them.
Yep.
As far as TypeScript goes, a big part of it, if you've been watching, especially like the keynotes from Rails World for the last, which was a couple weeks ago, and then like last year in October, um, it's been pretty clear that David is much more DHH. He's much more in favor of. He's moved a lot more toward import maps. And a lot of the benefit that he's talking about is not having a build step, right? If you have TypeScript, you have to have it transpiled to JavaScript. And so by not using TypeScript, you avoid that step and you can actually just have your JavaScript written and have it loaded into your import map and then just come into your application that way. And so you avoid
But
that
didn't he
process.
also say that he's kind of opposed to static typing on principle?
I've gotten that impression. I don't know that I could go find a place where he's actually directly said that. You may be able to, and that's definitely the sentiment that comes through. Um, but yeah, and I'm kind of in the same boat, right? I am not a big fan or proponent of having typing built into my stuff. Um, and I think that, as Tomer's mentioned, is kind of more of an aesthetic thing. I've never really felt the benefit of it when I've done it. And so I'm just not a huge proponent of it. It doesn't mean I'm against it. It's just that some of the other benefits, like not having a build step and things like that, um, make it so that I look at it and say, well, in order to get that, the trade off just isn't worth it because I don't see the benefit for it, if that makes sense. Um, it's interesting. I'm gonna kind of take it back because I have some other thoughts on this particular premise that is being brought forward, because I generally agree that in a lot of cases, capability wise, and the different approaches that the different languages are going to kind of push you toward to get a job done. Yeah, there's not a major um, difference as far as them being able to do the job. One thing that I've seen, though, is that depending on what the advancement is and how actively those are being worked on, so this has more to do with ecosystem really than language. Um, we see that they tend to converge, like you said, Tomer. But the difference is that depending on where those innovations are coming from, being on the leading edge of a lot of that stuff is a benefit. But like I said, I think that has more to do with the ecosystem you're in. So, for example, um, I just I just watched last week the from Rails World, right? And so he's talking about, hey, we're simplifying the stack and we're simplifying deployment and we're making it easier, and so he's talking about all these different things. A lot of good ideas have come out of Ruby into other languages. A lot of great ideas have come from other languages into JavaScript or into Ruby. Ruby's adopted some of this stuff, right? And so the convergence is there, but I also look at it and think, okay, well, because I have the benefit of these particular things that have come into the ecosystem that haven't been adopted elsewhere yet, I'm able to get more done in the system I use and things like that. And yes, some of that comes down to experience, but I think some of it also comes down to the language and its approach and the philosophy behind it and things like that. And so I generally mostly agree with you that programming languages, there may be differences in, hey, I want to pick this for this, right? If I'm doing system programming or something that needs that kind of characteristic, I'm probably going to reach for Rust as opposed to Ruby or JavaScript. But beyond those basic things, I still think that there are meaningful differences between languages and systems that allow us to operate and be more productive, reach certain goals. If you care more about some characteristics than others, then you can reach for one over the other. And so, like, I don't know that there's an empiric this language is better than that language, so much as if you're working in this area, it's not just down to does it give you better tools, but does it give you better tools that literally make you move that far ahead. And web in particular and back end is so disparate that I feel like there really are. I mean, I use Rails and I'm biased that way, but I feel like there are a lot of really serious advantages that come from using Rails that other systems don't have. And
Yeah, but are
so,
those advantages, are those advantages from Rails or from Ruby? And could a Rails-like system have been built on something other than Ruby?
right.
Because the
So
discussion here at the end of the day is not so much about Rails, it's more about Ruby versus other programming languages.
I would
That's fair.
argue that's a
I think
distinction. That's a
I think
distinction
some
that
of them
doesn't.
come from Ruby, but I think some of them come from Rails and could be built in other systems.
I would argue that that distinction doesn't really exist. When you pick a language, you pick an ecosystem. We are so far beyond, as an industry, as a discipline, we're so far beyond the point where you would build something on the language plus a very, very lean standard library. You'd have to reach out to a whole bunch of stuff to build even the simplest of systems of the sort that we're talking about. Again, there are exceptions to that rule. So if you're a kernel developer, you absolutely have to have
Yeah, you have to do
some degree of control over what the compiler generates and how these parts integrate and interact with each other, which is why you would reach for a systems programming language that doesn't have a live runtime, right? That doesn't have
right.
garbage collection or whatnot.
Hmm.
That being said, for the mainstream, and by the mainstream I mean, the let's put it this way, not the part of the industry that existed 20, 30 years ago when a lot of us were starting our careers, but the part of the
Hmm.
industry
Okay.
that grew up on top of that, because the industry didn't just change, it grew exponentially. Like it grew crazy wise in the last 20
Hmm.
years. So a lot of the software that we end up writing today in the mainstream, um, there are nuances. Sure, you might prefer some element of an ecosystem or a language or other, but as if what you're building is not in a domain where there is a tangible ecosystem advantage. So for instance, right now, if you're training models and integrating in all LLMs and whatnot, probably you're going to reach for Python because it's the go-to ecosystem. It's the one that moves the fastest, et cetera, et cetera. Um, that is why you'd reach for Python, not because you think Python is a better language for that sort of
That's
work
fair.
than Java or whatever. Now, once the ecosystems reach that kind of parity, which again, for most kind of business use case sort of software that you would build, if you're in the front end and you're not on native, you're on the web, you don't really have that much of a choice. You can basically choose JavaScript or something that compiles to JavaScript,
Hmm.
which again becomes more of an aesthetic choice than anything. Like you want to use Elm, sure, there are trade-offs for your organization, not for the system you end up building, because it's all going to be running in a browser the same as any other JavaScript-based thing you're going to build. Um,
Yeah,
so
but people writing Elm, for example, will swear by the fact that when their code compiles, it's correct.
Yes.
speaking
And
as
which is not something you can say about JavaScript or
I would
TypeScript.
say two things to that. One, it's hyperbole. Okay, if someone actually came up to my face and uttered that sentence with a serious face, I'd call their bullshit because that's just what it is. No, if your code compiles, it's not production grade. Don't give me that crap. Come on, we're grown-ups. Second,
I think we just got
speaking
a whole
and
bunch of sacred
qualifying that.
hamburger out of that one.
Yeah. And just to qualify that assertion, okay, I am strictly in the statically typed, statically compiled language camp. As an aesthetic preference, I'm a Scala guy, right? And I have been for many years. I'm a co-founder of what ended up being the Scala community in Israel and the conference that we had around that. So that's kind of my personal bias, and I can explain why that is my preference. But fundamentally, I come from the camp of languages that don't provide, because no language can provide that, but that sort of drive you towards building code in a way where if it compiles, there is a very good chance that it'll actually run correctly in production. It's not going to guarantee that. Neither will 100% code coverage in your tests, but we'll probably circle that to that point later. The point I'm trying to make here is
So
if the ecosystem,
before you get to that point,
yeah,
because you brought up Scala and the fact that you were a founding father of the Scala community,
yeah.
based on what you're saying today, would you have founded Scala, the Scala community today, given what Java can do? Because effectively, what you seem to be saying is, Scala, Java, they both run on the JVM. They're kind of
So
parity.
I absolutely would, because of two very fundamental things. One is circling back to my original assertion, it's a matter of aesthetics. I don't say that aesthetic preferences don't matter. These are my aesthetic preferences. If I'm growing flowers in vases around my house and I start a community around that, it's because I like flowers. It doesn't necessarily mean that flowers are objectively important. That's one thing. The second thing is that when I was heavily into Scala and espousing Scala in the Israeli tech community, Java couldn't do what Java can do now in the sense of expressivity. Sure, you could build systems in Java, but I would argue then, as now, that Scala has advantages over Java. It doesn't make it a more useful language or a more successful language or even a preferable language necessarily for some people. There were organizations that have managed to convince to take the plunge, and they decided to do so with the trade-off that it's going to be much harder to hire people to work in Scala, which, by the way, did not turn out to be the case, but that was the assumption, because they felt they had something to gain from that choice. But it's not to say that if they had picked Java instead or Python instead, they would have been any less successful. Wix, by the way, which is a company you and I worked for, was for many years a poster child of Scala industry use, especially in Israel. Was it a good call for Wix? I think so, for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that decision made a significant contribution or put any sort of significant chunk of Wix's success in business or finance on the table. It just didn't have anything to do with it. Wix could have been
So,
developed in Java, in Scala, in Python, in any of those languages.
so would you make then the same argument around TypeScript versus JavaScript, where it's an aesthetic decision? Doesn't mean that TypeScript is necessarily better, but it does have some areas where it reads better and it's a little
I
nicer to
would
work in and has some other advantages to it.
I would, and this is, I would argue against that, or rather, I would say, yes, I would make the same argument with respect to TypeScript and JavaScript because, and this is a qualitative argument with no data to back it up, uh, circling back to an original sentiment, we as an industry have learned that static types, that known ahead of time static types, are extremely useful in some cases. So JavaScript, sorry, just doesn't have that. TypeScript adds that on top of JavaScript in a way that's been tried before to some degree of success or other with CoffeeScript and with Flow, but TypeScript made it work substantively better than those other options in a way that allowed it to enter the mainstream. But
and
what caused the adoption of TypeScript, in my opinion, is the very real value of having static types, especially in libraries of which you integrate a great many in any front-end project. So in that respect, TypeScript is quote unquote better than JavaScript because it's a superset of JavaScript and because it adds something we as an industry find useful. That being said, it compiles down to JavaScript, so clearly everything you build in TypeScript, you can build in JavaScript. But
it's
this is one
beyond
instance, yeah.
it's just to say it's beyond being compiled down to JavaScript. It's effectively you invest lot of effort into writing TypeScript types, and then they all get erased out of your code when it's deployed into the
Yeah, but
production.
the value proposition isn't at runtime,
Oh
which,
yeah,
by
of
the way,
course,
is a
of course.
distinction from the .NET and Java ecosystems where types do matter at runtime. That being
Or
said,
C++. Plus.
that depends on how you write it, but sure. The point I'm making here is TypeScript to me is an evolutionary state of JavaScript. Like treating it as a separate language, to my mind, as sort of an outside observer. I have no dog in this race, right? I don't do my everyday work in JavaScript or TypeScript. I do occasional work in JavaScript and TypeScript and Python and a whole plethora of other languages. So I don't care in a sense, but as an outside observer perspective and tying to this convergent evolution of languages uh, statement or argument, is that this is that evolutionary state. So
I
Python at around 3.8 or 3.7, I think, started getting optional typing. Around the same time, TypeScript started taking off. These are those ecosystems version of a worthwhile feature that they took from statically typed languages.
just to make things, you know, how would I phrase it? Just to make things factually correct. TypeScript and JavaScript, there might be some convergent evolution. Obviously, these two are tied at the waist, but they are distinct programming languages. There's a JavaScript, the ECMAScript standard says nothing about standard typing. It's highly probable that it never will,
And it
whereas
is
types.
highly, and this is a prediction that may or may not prove true, and I might eat my words, but it also means that it's a standard that in 5 to 10 years, the only relevance it has is for supporting legacy software, of which there is a lot. I don't deny it. But the ECMAScript standard that doesn't have anything to do with typing is about as relevant as the latest COBOL standard.
Chuck, I will say this about the value of types. So I'm actually going through a fairly large legacy project at work, that's been that's like 100% JavaScript, and we are gradually adding static typing into it. And I actually tweeted about this, that the biggest challenge in adding the static typing is fixing all the bugs that it discovers.
Hmm.
Uh, so, for example, like yesterday, I ran into a problem there where this legacy system uses Mobix, and Mobix has this concept of an observable array, which is kind of like which extends regular JavaScript arrays. It's very similar to JavaScript arrays, but it's not quite the same. It has methods that regular JavaScript arrays don't have, for example. And people played fast and loose with it. They would assign like observable arrays and arrays into the same variables, and the system now that and obviously the software works. It's legacy. It's I like to say legacy software is software that works. It's deployed. Customers are using it, so it works somehow. But it's also obviously a bug. Now maybe
Mhm.
this bug doesn't actually manifest itself in production. Maybe it does, and the system still somehow works because the web platform is very forgiving, for both good and bad. Um, but like I said, it's obviously a bug, and it's been around probably for years. And I've found it now because I'm adding static type information into the project.
Yeah, I would just put forward that, because we're talking about different languages having different characteristics. The two systems for Ruby are RBS and Sorbet. RBS is maintained kind of by the Ruby core team, and then Sorbet is put out by Shopify. Um, they tend to feel more onerous than surfacing any issues like this, right? And so, and I think, sure, as some systems get more complex, I don't know if I have the right terminology for exactly what,
I would
because
say
complex is kind
large.
of a vague term, but as things become more interconnected, as people are pulling in more libraries, maybe it might begin to pay off. But my theory is more that, as Tomer said, there are a lot of efforts that were tried to get something like TypeScript to work in JavaScript to add the static types, and I'm thinking more along the lines of, these just aren't the right solution if we're going to do it in Ruby. It just doesn't jive with the way the language goes. I also have to say that the duck typing and the approach that we take to a lot of things in Ruby, it really feels just free. I can just do what I need to do, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying, there are definitely things that inform the way people work in these languages to where, yeah, I don't think just saying static typing is necessarily the answer. I think there's more nuance to a lot of this. And I think, to be honest, as we've kind of seen the convergence evolution of a lot of these languages, that's what we see there too, right? Is that everybody kind of does it kind of their own way as they adopt these things. And so it's not just this language is picking up what this other language innovated. It's that we found a way to do it in a way that works with the way that people approach and think about problems in that language.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
you know, I guess I'm not really trying to defend anything more. I'm just trying to say, um, I haven't seen the benefit, and it's mostly because what I'm doing just it hasn't had the payoff. But you
So,
know, I mean, all of this could change. You just never know.
so I would add to that that first of all, I think it's not just legit or fine that you hold to those positions. It's a valid trade-off to make. So one canonical difference, which I think was very evident in both what Don described in his experiences and what you, Charles, did, is that it's all a trade-off. It's a difference of what it is that you stress in the system. So my intuition, and again, qualitative argument, I have no data to back it up, and I don't think anyone ever will, or at least not in my lifetime. I could be wrong. Um,
You
what I
sometimes even
see,
are.
sometimes I
Well,
even are. What I see is the value of static typing, or rather static typing is a bit of a large term. The value of the sort of typing that I'm talking about, which can be achieved with static typing, but also with gradual typing, as you can
mhm.
see in TypeScript or Python and other languages, really starts to bear fruit at a certain, not complexity level, but at a certain size of the thing that you're building and the number of constituent interconnected parts that comprise it. So it's not so much about whether what you're building is
That's probably a
complex or
better way of stating. I couldn't find the way of saying it, but yeah, that makes
yeah.
a
So
lot of
it's
sense.
it's it mostly starts manifesting for real in my experience two cases. One is when the system grows past a certain volume of stuff that's in it, and that's true of any language I've ever worked with, including statically, dynamically typed, what have you. The other situation, which I think is where the sort of productivity gains perceived by the industry are coming from, is it aids in someone not knowing what the code is and how it's constructed, but knowing what it is supposed to do and how code is constructed in the general sense of things. Being able to get involved with the system or engage with the system at a fairly deep level, the only way you can do that rapidly without significant onboarding and significant prior knowledge, which, by the way, as a Rails guy, you already have. So when you come into another system built on built in Ruby on Rails, you already have that
Right.
massive baggage of how the system is built because Rails is very, very prescriptive. And that is the trade-off I feel that DHH is kind of espousing. And fair enough, there is no denying that you can be extremely productive if you're a Rails engineer moving from one system built in Rails to another. I've seen it, right? I've
Mhm.
seen people do that, and they're extremely productive. The difference is Rails is incredibly prescriptive, and as a result of that, is a good fit for some systems, maybe even most systems of
Mhm.
that sort. I don't know. But it is definitely a very, very poor fit for other types of systems that are in the mainstream. Otherwise, I think we would be seeing more success in Ruby on Rails as we did in the 2000s.
Mhm.
So my argument here is there are trade-offs that stress different parts of the system under different circumstances. The most visible trade-off of picking a dynamic versus static language is in a dynamic language, especially on projects that don't meet that sort of size or volume threshold and have a relatively small number of people that engage with that system in its life cycle, which, by the way, is a thing that happens very often, which is why Rails was and continues to be somewhat successful. Um, as long as those limits are met, it is an incredible experience. And you see that with a variety of languages, that some of which have inspired Ruby. So you still see people that
Mhm.
have worked on production systems in Smalltalk raving about what it felt like to work on production systems in Smalltalk.
Right.
Not having had that experience, I'm not going to argue with them about it, but they kind of express what that did for them in the same way, that it felt very liberating. And I categorically will not deny that, or that there's a productivity boost to be had by that. But you take a Ruby on Rails engineer, you drop them into, no prior knowledge, you drop them into a sufficiently voluminous code base in any other language, they will be able to onboard, because
Mhm.
not because there's nothing wrong with Ruby, and you're not, you don't not know something coming from
Right.
Ruby. You have your preferences. But my point is that the reverse is not true. You take people that are well versed in production systems in a variety of languages, you drop them into a Rails system to extend it or fix it or improve the build process or whatever it is that they want to do in that system, because it relies so heavily on sort of ingrained knowledge of the philosophy of Rails, how things are designed, how things are built. If you don't have that coming in, and you don't have that also kind of dated to when that system was built, because modern Rails doesn't look quite like Rails from 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, and in some cases vastly different. Unless you have that knowledge, you're just not going to be able to get up to speed and be productive in that system in any way, shape, or form without significant handholding. And I've been in that position myself, and it's not pleasant. Whereas you have the same experience, by the way, with a system built in Python or PHP from 10 years ago, because then they didn't have some of these quality of life enhancements. You didn't have
Right.
known types and known error conditions, and a hell of a lot more Python docs that you could see in your IDE than, you just didn't have those things 10 years ago. Whereas today, coming from any language that's modern and mainstream to any other language that's modern and mainstream is not going to be smooth sailing, because languages are different and there are nuances, but you're going to be able to figure out where you are in the code. You are going to be able to navigate to related things in the code without having a lot of ahead of time knowledge. And that matters. That matters with bigger products, with bigger teams, with products whose life cycle spans many years and many teams and many people. Um, and I think that is the primary motivator for those typing systems, even in traditionally dynamic languages like Python, JavaScript, whatever. Again, Ruby espouses a different philosophy, a different set of trade-offs. I don't deny that they're valid. I don't necessarily subscribe to them.
Right.
And if I were to find a legit argument against that, I would say simply look at the math, look at the popularity. Ruby was extremely popular for just short of a decade. That decade is long gone and it never picked up since, and there's nothing to indicate that it will.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not because Ruby is bad or Rails is bad.
Right.
It's against my personal biases, but you can build systems. I mean, I've used Basecamp extensively. It's a great product. I don't care what it's written in as long as it
Right.
works. So yeah, you see the languages in the mainstream, circling back to our original premise, right? You see the languages in the mainstream. There are nuances, there are philosophical differences. Those do matter in the tactical sense. Like as you write code, you're not going to write the same code in Python as you do in Java or Scala or any of those languages, or in TypeScript or in JavaScript. But you look at the ecosystems and they're all learning from each other and offering what appears to be a productive in the broad sense set of features. And type systems is I think just the most visible of those. You also have dependency management, which frankly wasn't a thing 20 years ago,
Right.
right? Maven was probably one of the first two major dependency management stacks. Pip picked up
Hmm.
a lot of that. Then Pip kind of languished. Poetry came along to fix, some of these things and learn other lessons. And then you have Cargo, which is probably the biggest, newest one of the bunch that learned a lot of those lessons from languages that are in completely different spaces. Rust
Don't forget
doesn't compete
npm.
with TypeScript.
Don't forget
Yeah.
npm.
I'm trying to, but it's not going to work out. But no, I mean that I'm being intentionally cynical here. I would say
NPM's
that
really good for
NPM had
installing
a
Yarn.
colossal influence. I do not have a dog in this race either, but I can say as a disinterested observer that NPM has had a colossal impact on pretty much every ecosystem out there. Without NPM, we would not have Cargo, including the things that Cargo does better simply because it learned those lessons.
Right.
Right? So that is what I mean by convergent evolution. You have a lot of the same things. And by the way, a lot of languages, JavaScript used to be the poster child for, oh, there's no build. Isn't it great? I just update the code and there it is, which comes with an incredible set of trade-offs. And some of those trade-offs, by the way, were very early on ruled not by me and not by people hating on JavaScript like I do, ruled by the reality of it, ruled by the community of people producing functional production code as being a non-issue. You
Hmm.
had a build process in many, 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 many JavaScript systems over the last 20 years, if only for dependency management, asset bundling,
Hmm.
obfuscation, minification, what have you. All these things you couldn't get in a runtime system, so it was not a worthwhile trade-off, right? So that ostensible advantage is not an advantage as such, it's a trade-off. And I think a lot of those trade-offs are made because the ecosystem hasn't met those challenges properly in a way that doesn't require a trade-off
I,
like it
I
does today.
really I really want to try to get to the second sacred cow, and we seem to be
I was
stuck on the
gonna.
first.
I was wondering
So
if we were gonna get to any others.
Well,
so so unless you've got something really insightful to add, Tomer, I would like to move along.
I think that that does not have much chance of ever happening.
If we do number two, we're not getting to any of the other ones.
We can have Tomer on again.
I'm fine with that. This has been fascinating to talk through.
All right,
So
so
let's
what's the
try
second
to
one?
at least touch on the second one.
Let's.
Chuck, so you're going to read the second one, or should I?
I will read the second one. So this is what he's going to debunk. This is not
Ish.
so. See, anyway, it's clean code is important.
All right, so I'll start by qualifying that clean code
You
in this
better, because
clean
I was
code in
gonna
this
say
context.
I don't know
No,
if
no,
I
because
agree with you on
I'm
this.
going to be talking about exactly what you think I'm going to be talking to. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So when I say
Okay.
clean code, what I mean is the set of perceived notions of what clean code is and how to write it, as had been espoused in the industry. And we said we might name drop, but I mean, you can't not name drop Uncle Bob as the
Yeah,
progenitor of these practices.
Uncle Bob's a good friend of mine, but
Uh, cool. So what I'm
he
gonna
knows where I
say.
disagree with him too, so that's fine.
All right. So here's what I have to say on the subject. My issue with the with clean code has nothing to do with its intent. And the intent, the way I see it, is to help people design systems that are more readable, that are more sensible. It's all of those best intentions that the way to hell
More
is paved
maintainable
with.
is the way I typically approach it.
Fair
Yeah, but
enough. All of
did
those.
you just notice what Tomer said? He said that's the way, the way to hell is paved with good intentions about
Yeah,
clean code.
because the rules of because what clean code is prescriptive, and the way people understand it is as a set of rules and practices that must be adhered to, or the
Okay.
code is bad, or the code isn't clean. So there are a lot of examples to this, but the kind of most obvious, and I think in many ways most egregious one, is dry, is do not repeat yourself. And there is a fascinating amount of demagoguery going on in the industry around that and similar rules, where you will sooner or later in your career, if you haven't already, and by you, I mean everyone with more than half a year of experience, run into someone telling you, oh, but why don't you extract these two identical lines that come with, within 20 lines of each other into a method? Because they're the same and they're reusable. Or if they're slightly more advanced in they're digging into this only when that identical line shows up three times, because if it doesn't show up three times, then it's not, you don't draw it.
Beetlejuice,
No,
Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice.
yeah, no, that's a prescription, and it's a really terrible prescription. First of all,
Okay.
because it doesn't do anything. Second of all, it's because it wastes a whole heap of people's time thinking about the wrong thing. And third, because it causes it and other uh, discussions of clean code end up wasting no more and no less time than arguments about code formatting used to back in the day. Because the rules are approximate. The rules are intended are prescriptive and intended not for you to follow religiously. That's my read on it, and that's kind of the my
That's
my assumption of the intent behind the words, right? I don't
that's my
like I don't
understanding as well.
yeah. I don't know Uncle Bob. I'm not gonna this is not an ad hominem thing. My concern with these rules is that people take them as gospel without considering what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So the rules of clean code are not in and of themselves, they might be evil, but the intent isn't. The intent, to my mind, um, is just misguided. The intent is
Yeah.
to build
So
systems that are more maintainable, as you say, or readable, or any of these things, without actually reaching for what it is that makes a system more maintainable or readable or navigable or any of these things.
which is
Simplicity versus complexity. And I can define those things, and we may want to, but critically, those rules, to my mind, right, as in my own reading of them, were they're not so much that people know not to repeat themselves more than twice in code, because that's just garbage. The rules are there to get people thinking, what is simple? What will make this code easier to grasp, easier for another person, which, as the saying goes, might be me in 6 weeks? What will make it easier to read this code, figure out what it does, why it does it, how it does it, with a minimal of external drivers or external knowledge. And that to
so.
me is simplicity.
So here I'm going to push back on something. Um, I think what you might be ignoring is the fact that is kind of the thing that comes up. It came up very early in the industry in the form of the mythical man months. Is the
Mhm.
fact that not all
such a good book,
programmers,
by the way.
yeah, the fact that not all programmers are
Another
created equal.
sacred cow to
Yeah,
deal with
um,
later.
yeah. The fact that half the programmers in the world are worse than the average programmer. Um, and
Definitely, definitionally, I guess it's true.
Mean.
it's
Yeah,
mean,
the
but it's
mean.
Mean
true.
programmer.
It's mean, but it's true by definition. Yeah, well, okay. It,
Whatever.
yeah, I think in this particular case, the average and the mean are probably fairly close.
Yeah.
Um,
We're talking humans for a change, so normal
yeah,
distribution applies.
Mhm.
yeah, it's not like wealth. So, what I'm trying to say is if you've got a team on which you've got a top-notch developer that is able to make sure that the system as a whole retains this attribute of simplicity, then you don't need to adhere as much to these kind of strict rules and guidelines. When you're on teams or that don't have such a person, then maybe having overly strict rules is a good thing, don't you think?
Well, speaking as a statically typed guy, I can't very well rail against that argument, but taking it a little bit more head on, there's two issues I have with that argument that I think kind of nullify that argument. The first is it doesn't actually argue anything beyond, oh, other people are stupid, it's for their own good, which is not an argument that I buy, even though, I might subscribe to that opinion. Um, the second issue I have with it is engineers that don't have an that haven't over the course of presumably several years. They don't have to be super senior developers, right? But if you've been in the industry for a couple of years, presumably wrote a bunch of code, presumably read quite extensively more code than you wrote to begin with, and you haven't developed an appreciation for the basic truth that copy pasting a complex bit of code over and over again is bad, then your problem isn't that you don't have the right rules in place to limit you. Your problem is that your company hired you to do a job that you're probably incapable of doing. Now, that being said, that sounds like gatekeeping, probably because it is, because I can't help it, but the to bring that home and perhaps save my own skin with other people. My point is this: some types of programming you can do with these types of guardrails in place, and there is room for that work in the industry, I hope, right? But the types of systems that you will be able to work on is not infinite. You're not going to be able to build large production grade, long lived, difficult systems that deal with actual problems that are interesting if you are not willing to put in the thought and learn what makes code more readable, more navigable, etc. And you have people around you to help you do that. So it's not like if you are a junior developer and you come in and you make a quote unquote dry violation mistake, you're going to get fired. You're hopefully going to, because you're a junior developer, you were hired in a context where you can be, functional and you have support. You're probably going to have the person next to you, that senior developer, explaining why this makes the code worse. But you're not likely to have a set of guardrails keeping you from making those mistakes, because those guardrails are literally anathema to the way virtually any practicing software engineer works. So if imagine you were working on a system and you were writing code and your code would not compile because the compiler feels that you have, those two lines of code identical in three places, so that's a dry violation, and you can't compile the code, right? That sounds ridiculous, because it is, because the assumption is if you're working on those systems, you have to have both a taste for code, whereby you would learn very early on why that's a mistake and you would stop making it, because it's communication, right? There is nothing inherently wrong with having several copies of the same code in the same place. It's a trade-off, right? What is the trade-off? If you can't have that conversation, you're never going to become a better developer. The guardrails aren't going to help you get there. They're just going to stop everyone else from doing their job.
I,
So
I, I think this is a great topic, and one I think we should probably have you on to discuss at length about what
Yeah.
is actually simplicity in coding. We probably don't have time to do it justice. I'll just add the fact that I never liked Douglas Crockford's linter. What's it called? JS lint, the original
Yeah.
linter, because it basically said, Douglas Crockford said, this is JavaScript, the good parts. Everything else is not good by definition because I said so. And I built this linter to enforce my rules, and you can't modify it. And there's a reason ESLint won. And because you know when you're so dogmatic, it's a problem.
Contrary
um
wise, there's a reason Java lost, if you can call it that. And the reason Java isn't anywhere near as popular as it used to be, percentage wise, for building the types of systems that Java used to be popular for, is because a lot of people were thrown off and turned away by what is to a seasoned, experienced engineer or academician a rigorous type system that forces you to not make mistakes. Whereas a lot of practicing developers would look at it and go, yeah, but who gives a damn? That's completely trivial. I don't care. I don't want to have to mess with it, and moved on. So the languages that ended up being successful are the ones that found a workable middle ground, and I include in that list, by the way, later iterations of Java. Modern Java isn't anywhere near as verbose or, pardon my French, anal retentive as traditional Java used to be. And that is because other languages showed that that kind of, it's not just verbosity. Everyone, rails against Java being verbose, but it's also that precision just isn't necessary in a lot of things, right? The common case where you have a class and that class has hash code into string and a few constituent components is common enough that it makes sense to have a first class language concept around it. And it took Java way too long to reckon with that, but eventually it got record classes. The sort of same ad hoc data containers that every other language has had since the beginning of time, because it's convenient and useful and doesn't require the level of control and precision that Java espoused at the beginning. So things evolve across the board. I'm not trying to make the point, um, this kind of circles back to original Kyle, but with this as well, is the tools that win tend to be the tools that are not the most rigid or the most liberating, and for a very good reason. It's because having absolutely no guardrails is a recipe for disaster, which is why hardly anyone writes business software in C or C++ anymore. It's because you don't get anything in return to that level of precision and control. You only get the bugs, right, for those domains.
Mhm.
Um, Anything that's sufficiently successful in the modern sense has made those trade-offs willingly. And I think we find those trade-offs being made in every ecosystem, kind of converging on the same set of trade-offs roughly, with nuances and preferences. Um, as for clean code is prescriptive and therefore bogus. The problem
Well,
is the rules are not the rules are well intentioned, but they provide the wrong kind of guidance, and end up causing more damage than harm, in my opinion.
so I'm gonna jump in on some of this. So, um, like I said, I've talked to Uncle Bob quite a bit. I've actually talked to him about the Clean Code book. We also I ran a book club for a while. In fact, I still kind of do. But so we did Clean Code. We also did Clean Architecture. A lot of the things that we talked through as we talked through the book. Um, right, he wrote it when he was writing a lot of languages that frankly are pretty different from Ruby or JavaScript, where I was primarily working. And so I'd point some of these out, either, hey, this doesn't make as much sense in the world I live in as the world that, this seems to be written for. And he agreed, right? And so in a lot of cases, yeah, they're kind of prescriptive, and maybe he doesn't make that as clear. that, hey, look, you've got to apply this as makes sense depending on what you're doing. A lot of the ideas in the book Clean Code and a lot of the ideas in the book Clean Architecture, I picked up another one, I can't remember, Clean Agile, I think I also read. And the main thing is I find that the rules or ideas behind the rules are definitely worth discussing with your team, right? And having the conversation, hey, look, when we're naming variables, we ought to consider these things. When we're writing out our code, we ought to consider these things, right? So when you get down to, follow standard conventions, I mean, that makes it approachable for anybody who works in the language or framework or whatever. You get into keeping it simple, I think, is one of his points, which is also your point. But yeah, as you get into some of the other ones where it's like, here's how you formulate comments, and here's how you name variables, and here's how you do these kinds of things. Yeah, some of those I found just, were a little bit tough to swallow. But it was mainly because my context was different enough to where I could come up with a guideline that made sense for what I was doing. And down to like dry. Yeah, I think it's funny because you mentioned, what if your tool told you that it wouldn't compile if it wasn't dry enough? And back in the day, earlier in the Ruby community, there were tools that would do code analysis and they would point out areas of your code that weren't dry. And what I found was at least half, if not more than half, significantly more than half in some cases, in some of the code bases I worked in, it'd point out something wasn't dry and it was wrong, right? It was, it like structurally the code looked similar, but in reality, the concern was different enough to where it didn't make sense to combine them. Like you would have been putting in edge cases every other line. Oh, this is different from that here. And so we're going to do this way instead of that way. And it just, you're better off having two things that look kind of the same. And so again, I think there's a heavy dose of common sense that comes with this. Initially, when I saw your point, I thought you were going to make the point that, trying to have code that's easy to understand and clean and maintainable and stuff like that is kind of an overblown
making the
concern.
case for cowboy coding.
And yeah, and I was going to say, no, you really do need to, have some level of, hey, you can look at this, you can understand it. And then that, like you said, that's the goal of clean code. But my deal is with a lot of these, or if you read other, because there are other books that give different rules or standards.
Yeah.
And the reality is you've got to figure out what works. And in some cases, it's not just works for your team. Sometimes it's this code base has a set of problems that if you apply the standard from the other code base you're working in, it's just not going to work. One other case I want to make is several years ago, Sandy Metz, she had a set of rules for how you formatted your Ruby code. And it was, you should never have a method that's longer than so many lines. You should never have more than so many arguments in your methods. You shouldn't have more than so many lines of
And then
code in
I
your
hate it so
classes.
much when my method ends up being one line too long.
Yeah, and that was the problem. And then you're looking at it and you're scrutinizing it and you're trying to figure out, right? Because there were linters in Ruby that would enforce it, and it would fail the build fail CI if it was right. So you had an eight line method, and you're looking at it and you're going, well, the only way to get it that way is essentially to create a second method and just put two of the lines in it, which doesn't help. And
So
so
I will add to that. There's two things here, right? There's, first of all, circling back to really the beginning of the conversation. A programming language is a language. It's about communication. Like,
yes,
fundamentally, I think I've read some guy at some point, probably 20, 30 years ago, putting it as a prose that's readable by humans and executable by machine. Right, which I think is a very highfalutin way of putting it, but it's close enough to reality. What matters when it comes to the way the code is structured and formatted are the people. If it does what it's supposed to do, then the only reason why you should ever care what the machines think is when the code doesn't compile, obviously, on the one hand, But if you have a typically a performance oriented thing that
Right.
requires you to express something in a way convoluted to humans, but more easily executable to a machine. That can happen. That's niche though. So by and large, when you do the work you do it for other humans, and one of those humans might be you in 6 weeks. Clean
Mhm.
code, as it is a very good thing in the sense that it was one of the few and only resources in sort of the space of how to build better code. Like it was an honest attempt at it. Um, but I think a lot of people read into it as again more of a prescription, more
Right.
it became its own thing. I'm railing not against the intent or against Uncle Bob personally. Again,
Right.
don't know him. That I've got nothing to add to that, but I am railing against the way it became embedded in the industry because, much like a topic we're not going to have time to discuss here again, which is TDD, it became more of on the one hand, a religion, and on the other hand, a gatekeeping practice than in what it was originally designed for, which is a set of useful tools deriving from a lot of thinking about a set of useful
Mhm.
ideas that can make you more productive or a better communicator. So saying clean code is bad is obviously a hyperbole to some
Right.
extent, but it is analogous to reading The Elements of Style in English, which is a fascinating book, very much worth reading for anyone who cares about communicating better in English. But it is also chock full of anachronisms and opinions that are not necessarily borne out in the intervening years. And I think clean code is kind of like that as well.
And before we conclude, I just have to give my number one rule. It's almost the only rule, really, is be consistent. A code base should strive for consistency.
Yeah.
It's somewhat an important rule, and I think it's also very overrated because now you run afoul of okay, what is a code base? If a code base contains 1,000 classes, do they have to be consistent, considering you might have had 40 different people from 5 teams working on them? Not necessarily. It's a trade-off. There is value to that, but there is also cost
There
in
are trade-offs to everything, and
enforcing it.
there are exceptions to. Then there obviously are exceptions to every rule. But I'm very much in favor of code consistency. And I think that these days we have tools in place to provide consistency guardrails across larger projects. And if you can manage it, it's a huge benefit because otherwise, when you read code, you get hung up on things that you shouldn't get hung up on. Like, why is this code different than that code? Well, because this was written by George and that was written by Tim is not a good
We
enough reason.
upgraded the
So,
framework. The old way works, and this is the new way.
so
No,
those are two
that's a
different
valid reason actually,
Those are
because you
two very
probably.
different reasons, and I think both are valid, by the way,
Hmm.
because again, when you code, whatever it is that you program, you are expressing a part of a problem both to the machine and another human. It is a form of expression by definition, which means by definition, two different people are going to express it differently.
Oh
And
yeah.
my point is, consistency is a valuable asset to some degree, and it becomes a liability from some other threshold. And assuming that consistency is always a positive is every bit as risky as saying, no, who cares about consistency? Let's all have, whatever, different code formatting for each code file, right? That's dumb, but it's no more or less dumb than saying, no, all files have to be identical, have to have consistent whatever's, because what you're doing is you're constraining all of your engineers, all of your communicators effectively in the same way where they're not going to be working in the same way on the same thing. even if it's the same person coming to the same piece of code 3, 6, 9 months later, they might have a different and potentially better way of expressing something. And a lot of the times, the ability to express something elegantly in code actually runs afoul of even something I'm not going to argue against, which is automatic code formatting. I'm all for automatic code formatting for a very simple reason, because I'm sick and tired of arguing, debating, or even talking about it. That is the only reason why I want to have, a code reformatter as part of my pipeline, is because I don't want to ever have one of those conversations again. That being said, I've often been in the position where the reformatted code just does not express the solution as elegantly as the code
Mm.
I would have formatted in some other way, because it runs afoul of that whatever rule the team put in place, right? So even trivial rules like line length or how many lines per minute, whatever it is that you end up having, you're going to have some subset of those in every project. Even those sometimes constrain your expressivity as an engineer more than you would like. Now, again, we're talking trade offs. The trade off of having those arguments about code formatting for the better part of 30, 40 years of my life is exactly why this trade off is worthwhile. I will give up a bit of expressivity so I don't have to ever have those conversations again. But that is why. It's not because inherently the consistency is a positive or the expressivity is a positive. It's always a trade off.
I think we need to uh, start wrapping up, Chuck.
Yeah, I think so. But
Yeah. We didn't even get to dunking on code coverage and dependency injection. Oh,
right?
Yeah, next time. Next time.
Yeah. So
There's always
Tomer,
a
if
next
people want
time.
to see what you're working on, writing, speaking about these days, where do they find your stuff?
well, I'm running my own consulting company, so that's Substrate Software Engineering. Substrate.co.il is the website. What I'm working on in commercial settings is not something I can generally talk about because it's customers' stuff, not mine. That being said, I have, as always, there's something um writing or presentation related down the road. So recently I gave a talk about migrating to AWS Graviton, taking a big production set of production systems actually, and moving them over to ARM 64. So that was an AWS hosted event a few months ago. What happens next is anyone's guess, but I'm always ranting about something or other on Twitter at Tomer G. And if you want to argue with me, engage with me, talk to me, or hire me, then you're more than welcome to reach out. Just look up my name. It's pretty internet unique.
I would like to add that Tomer has a whole bunch of talks which are all styled around the title of how shit works, and like how shit works the CPU, how shit works time, how shit works memory, whatever. And you can find all of these talks on YouTube, and I highly recommend watching them. They're all irreverent and all very highly educational and informative.
Awesome.
Yeah,
All right.
highly
Well, let's do.
irreverent is my middle name.
Oh, I'm getting there. Anyway, let's go ahead and get to some picks. Dan, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. So, our listeners might have noticed that this is my return after a bit of a hiatus. I haven't participated in like 4 or 5 episodes. Part of the reason was that I was on vacation. My wife and I, just the two of us, went to Italy together and toured all through South Italy. It was awesome. So my first picks would be, first of all, taking a vacation. Second, taking a vacation with your spouse. And third, taking that vacation in Italy. All of these would be my picks. I would like to mention two places in particular that we visited and are like extremely unique and really breathtaking and amazing. One of them is this town or city in Italy called Matera. It's, I don't know if you visited. It's like nothing else I've ever seen. It's kind of like this place where people like lived in caves in the rock and effectively built their city over the caves that they built in. And the living conditions used to be terrible, which is why this whole city was kind of evacuated in the beginning of the 20th century. But then they realized that it's really can be turned into an amazing tourist destination. So they've renovated it and rebuilt it, and it's just gorgeous. And we stayed there in a hotel that was like itself like kind of half a cave, and it's really amazing. It's like nothing I've ever seen, and I highly recommend visiting there. And if you do, and you go there, stay at the Quarry Resort. It was an amazing hotel, just 12 rooms, and it's really amazing. So that would be one place that's really worth mentioning. And another one is an even smaller town called almost a village, somewhere between a village and a town called Ostuni. It's again, it's a really old place that's been lived in for a millennia, but the current city was built in the Middle Ages. It's kind of like inside, effectively, it's almost like a fort. It's The old city is surrounded by walls. It's on the top of a hill with like these winding streets, and they're all cobbled with and staircases and whatnot. And it's also called the the Italians call it the white town, because the walls are like painted white, and the city really shines in the sun. It's an amazing sight. I highly recommend staying there. And yeah, so these two places especially, but in general, just take a vacation with your spouse and have a good time and work on that relationship. And so that would be my first pick. My second pick is I'm having an interesting time following along this whole kerfuffle, or well, it's way more than a kerfuffle now. It's a drama, I guess, in the WordPress community between Matt Mullenweg. Well, I always forget how he pronounces his name, and WP Engine. I think it's like the first example that I can think of an entire company and its user base and its contributions and whatever being ejected, forcefully ejected out of a large open source community. It's really quite amazing what's going on there. And if you like the drama, then follow along. And those
Well,
would be my picks for today.
so I'm going to pile on there because over the weekend they actually went after advanced custom fields as well, which is a plugin for WordPress that's pretty popular.
They took it over, I think.
Yes,
It
they
was
took it off of their basically their app store. I can't remember what it's called, plugin directory, and they put their own in.
and the funny thing is, if I understand correctly, their justification for doing it was that it had security issues. What they didn't say is that those security issues were not being fixed by the original developers, because those developers were affiliated with WP Engine and were ejected off of the WordPress community. So
Oh, I didn't follow that. I didn't realize that was the case, that it had a
So,
tie into the other issue.
so
it,
my qualm with this whole set of shenanigans is not being a WordPress user. I don't have anything to do with the community, but just reading about this and assuming what I read was even remotely accurate, it's not just that the plugin in question was taken off because of a security issue or even because of something irrelevant like being affiliated with a company. It's that it was forked, and the
Yeah.
fork was served from the whatever software repository that serves the whole community. So this isn't just a
no, they
spat
took control of
between,
it. They
yeah.
they
So
they they, they
Hmm.
basically took their project away.
so
Yep.
it's not just that, which is again not fully understanding the details or the companies involved. It's what I'm thinking about is from the perspective of a user. Imagine you're using Mac OS or Ubuntu or whatever system you use. There's a product you got off the respective app store for that.
Hmm.
You know, it would be, especially in a commercial setting, which is easier to explain because the outrage is a lot more kind of obvious. Is imagine I'm using a Norton Commander modern clone for Mac OS called Marta, which I highly recommend, by the way. Now, I'm paying for it happily. Now, imagine if I bought that off of the Apple Mac Store, and then, a couple years later, Apple just decided not just to yank it off the App Store with some, made up claim, but replace it with Marty, their own version of
Right.
Marta that was forked without my knowledge, consent, or, ignoring the commercial and human shenanigans behind the scene. That is effectively a betrayal of trust of whomever is running that software repository that I haven't yet seen many people decrying, but
Yeah.
I would have expected them to have them being users, not WP Engine, actual WordPress users. I would have expected to hear a lot of outrage over this. Because that's taking it one step further than the usual
Hmm.
open source versus commercial drama that we're kind of used to seeing at this point. And that
Right.
drama is explainable. The whole
That.
Redis thing, the Elastic thing, you can see where it's coming from. This is the same drama with someone abusing their authority in a way that is probably legal, I wouldn't know, but is incredibly harmful to the community around the product.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I saw the advanced custom fields piece of things kind of unfolding on Saturday, I want to say. So it's entirely possible that the community comes around and does what you're saying, right? Because it's Monday morning, but I don't know. Maybe they won't. But
Maybe they
yeah,
won't.
I
Whether they do or not will tell you a lot about open source governance in the
right.
coming years, I think.
That's where I'm interested is. Hey, okay, so what does this mean for anyone else? And not necessarily that I'm in communities where I anticipate this from anybody who leads any of those communities, but the fact that it can happen, you have to at least think about it. So
Did you see
anyway,
the checkbox that they put on WordPress.org?
Yeah, that if you want to log in, you have to certify that you're not affiliated with WP Engine or something like that.
no way.
Yeah,
Yes.
that had happened.
And like you said, Tomer, it's also not whether or not it's legal. This is so toxic to the community.
They
Yeah,
basically ejected WP Engine out of the WordPress community in a way
Yep.
that I've not seen done in any other open source project. Like very abruptly and very violently. Now, it might be justified, like Tomer, I don't have sufficient context, but the fact that it can be done is
I would have been a lot more at ease with even with this whole bizarre kerfuffle between two companies that are ostensibly complementary in the market. Again, as an outside observer, I don't actually know the details, but I would have been a lot more at ease if the plugin in question had been removed from the software repository because it had whatever. Even if you use that excuse of it had unpatched security vulnerabilities, fine. That's at least a valid excuse. But it wasn't yanked. It was
Replaced.
replaced with a fork, which is
Uh-huh.
not okay under any, like, this is basically I as a user gave permission to the tool chain around this repository to install a certain piece of software, assuming certain characteristics of the people running the show, both the repository and the people writing the plugin, based on their reputation. Suddenly, not only does that go away, but my uh, authorization to the tool chain to do that on my behalf is effectively usurped to support a different effort by different people that may or may not have, the reputation or characteristics that I want or that I agree to. So that to me is the really new thing about this whole drama, because everything else is just the usual. Opens someone did something good open source wise, it succeeded, they built a company around it. Someone else built a different company with a different business model that you could discuss whether or not they're leveraging off of someone else's work. But the point is, it's open source. If you didn't want someone to leverage off your work on their terms, you should have licensed it, not openly, right? That's
Yeah.
that's on whomever released the software in the first place. And again, that's not discounting moral arguments.
Right.
But this is not my issue with what Automatic did is not a moral argument. It is something that, not being a lawyer, I could never say is, but should be in the vicinity of uh actually bordering on antitrust. Like, this is people that have signed a EULA that have worked under some assumptions, and you yank the carpet and replace it under their feet. That should not ever
The
be done.
answer, by the way, is that if WP Engine wants to continue working with quote unquote WordPress, they should create their own fork.
And they probably will,
Yeah.
because there's a business there. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the situation to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
will
don't
also
know.
put out there that whatever the beef was, I remember looking at it and I didn't understand how, because WP Engine has been around for years and years and years and years, right?
Mhm.
And so I didn't understand that the
What's
situation had
changed?
changed at all to prompt this, right? It was just out of the blue from what I could tell. We should just do an episode on it and then just talk about what the
Yeah,
implications are
assuming
for
we
us.
have sufficient information,
Yeah,
it certainly has an impact for the web on the web, if for no other reason that a third
a lot of
of
stuff
websites
runs.
on the
Yeah.
web are still WordPress websites. Not by traffic, I'm just by counting domains.
Well,
Yeah,
if
but
you if
the
you
other
want
thing
to,
is a lot of people use WordPress on the back end of their JavaScript apps.
this it's gonna have an interesting to track effect,
Yeah.
and a set of second order effects on the industry. If you really want to see something that most everyone ignores, but that is coming and is gonna affect the web, is the whole kerfuffle with the IO domain.
Oh yeah,
So,
that's a funny
so
one. You heard
should I?
about that, Chuck?
No, I haven't. But
All right. So
we
I
get
dot
into it
.io.
another time.
Yeah. Okay. If we're at a
Because
thing,
I
we're at a
just
thing.
say this, the IO domain, like Google.io and stuff like that,
uh-huh.
it's going away.
Yeah.
Okay.
For
It's
for very simple and good reasons, but it's gonna have a heck of a
Yeah, that's
downstream
going to affect
impact on
some
everything.
things. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Like,
I know
say,
businesses that are
GitHub.
built on .io domains that, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Well,
so that's coming.
yeah, fun. I'm gonna jump in with my picks. So the game that I've been playing lately with my friends is Risk Legacy. I'm pretty sure I've picked this before. Board Game Geek has a weight on it of 2.59, which means that it's pretty approachable for casual gamers. It's a little more complicated than like Settlers of Catan, but you can play it and it's not terribly hard to pick up. If you've played Risk before, it's mostly Risk with some twists. We'll just put it that way. So yeah, so I'm enjoying that. And then real quick, just a couple of other picks. I have been reading lately. What's this book called? It's right here on my desk. It's Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. It is awesome. I'm really liking that. And so I'm going to pick that. I'm also going to encourage people to go out and vote. I recognize that I don't know how you vote, and many of you will vote different from how I vote. But do your homework, figure out who these people are, and then make the best decision you can. And yeah, those are my picks. Oh, one other thing, and this is kind of a self plug, but I am working on putting together a boot camp starting in January that will show people how to build AI agents. I'm going to have examples in Ruby and JavaScript. And so if you're interested in that, stay tuned because I'm going to put the sales page up soon. Tomer, what are your picks?
So I mean, beyond the whole thing with the IO country code top level domain going away, which is its own thing. One, I guess I would say pick is retro computing is awesome. On a previous visit to Germany a couple weeks ago, I got a TI 994A 8-bit computer from 1978 to add
It
to my
was
collection.
the first computer that I owned. By the
Yep.
way, it had a 16-bit GPU or something like that.
Or something like that. But anyway, it's a very early computer. It's gets added to my collection. This collection will be the seed to a full-blown interactive computer museum in the north of Israel when I retire and or the war ends, whichever happens first. Um, which brings me to my last pick, which is don't be in a war. It's not good for you. Um, as a plug, I just finished the first iteration of and am hammering on a Prometheus workshop for developers. So if anyone's interested in that, it will probably show up both as a commercial offering, but I'll probably be running it in some conferences in the foreseeable future. So if there's any interest in that, ping me and we'll see what we can make happen.
We should
So
talk about that, Tomo, because I've done quite a bit of Prometheus development relatively recently, and even gave a talk or two about it. So
Mhm.
okay,
I've started
well,
looking into it
you
for
know
some of
where
my
we had an episode
We
where
did.
about Prometheus here on JavaScript
everyone
Jamstack.
that uses Prometheus has an episode sooner or later. Don't worry about it.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks for coming, Tomer.
Sure, it's been a pleasure.
All right.
Thanks for opposing some of my opinions. It's always better when there's some back and forth.
Yeah. All right.
For
Well,
sure.
hang on for a second so that we can make sure we get uploaded. And until next time, folks, Max out.
Bye.
And you.